Hello, my name is Tess, and I'm here to talk about a series of prints I've been working on for the last couple of years. The name for them today is Lead Fabric. I keep changing my mind. I did a very short video about them back in January that some of you might have seen at the show and tell meeting, and I did another slightly longer one with Partners in Print at their Fall Print Futures program. So thank you to the Guild for having me do this again longer. And to Partners in Print for having me and helping me edit as I've learned how to talk about this process. So these are the Lead Fabric combination prints. They're small editions of illustrative prints where the patterns on fabric in the drawing are letterpress printed in a clamshell action press. And then after printing, the black line art is inked in by hand. The patterns are usually a couple passes of handset lead type, repurposed border materials mostly. Sometimes I use a couple mounted cuts, and I tile them over the part of the illustration that renders an article of clothing. The forms of type cover a slightly larger area. They bleed over the edges and are then conformed to the exact shape I need by printing through a Mylar mask cut in the silhouette of the clothing. So it's basically, if you do any digital art, a clipping mask done in meat space. So that's the basic system for any one of these prints. I will get into more technical details after. Each design has a specific wrinkle to how it was done. I just keep causing problems for myself. But yeah, I've been working on prints like these for about 2 years now and figuring out the technical limits. But I didn't get into it knowing why it was important to me to do it this way. There's other ways to do something similar. If it was just about rendering a pattern, it could be carved from linoleum for the illustration, or I could make plates for the specific illustration. So that's never grabbed my attention, so it's not about that. But what is it about? It's a process for me of compatible elements developing on parallel tracks in the back of your head, and eventually those parallel tracks do converge. So track one is how I got into printing. I grew up in the apartment above my mother's print shop. Maura Shapley, she's been printing letterpress in Seattle since the 70s. She started printing in high school, restarting the Garfield pen on an A.B. Dick. She would leave Garfield to go work on the pen at Lincoln with her teacher was Al Arians, since Lincoln actually had a printing department at that point. After high school, she did work in bindery. She did a lot of camera work and plate prep in offset shops around Seattle. And in order to stop working for other people, she bought her first C&P for $50 and started Day Moon Press in 1976. It's this same 1218, which is still our main job press. Most of my commercial work goes on that one. Day Moon Press was in Belltown first, and then it was on Aurora Avenue for about a year, and it moved into this same mixed-use building on Beacon Hill in 1982. My dad's family, they had a printing business in California that his grandfather started in 1934. So he grew up in that family business, him and all his siblings, as it went through letterpress and into offset phases. And as I grew up, my dad was always working printing jobs outside the house. He worked at Graphicolor, Unicraft, Atomic, Agency Northwest, United Graphics, Valco, Allied Printers, GAC, Allied Senveo. There are a few mergers and acquisitions encompassed in the list. The printing industry has not, I wouldn't say, been stable for the last couple decades. So that's the printing family I get raised in. And me and my sister did all kinds of cool little projects as kids. I'm pretty sure this is the first linoleum block I ever did. We cannot remember how old I was, but somewhere in elementary school. My mother looked at this linoleum block that I had done completely backwards, despite her clear instructions, I'm sure. But she didn't say she couldn't print it. She printed it on Mylar and then pasted it upside down to the cardstock. So I grew up doing those kinds of projects just for fun in the background. I went to college at Whitman in Eastern Washington, and I was an art major, but not actually a book art or printmaking concentration. Technically, I was drawing and painting concentration. And a lot of what I was doing there was these digital illustrations where I'm drawing the clothing and the fabric as a three-dimensional object, and then using clipping masks to trap these completely flat patterns to the fabric shapes. And the only concession to contouring is that I'm cutting the shape along seams and fold lines and then jogging that flat pattern at different angles so that they don't match at the edges. And what I like about this is being able to convey the object as its function but also its nature at the same time. The flat pattern on a bolt of fabric has weaving techniques or printing techniques. That's what the fabric is when it's made. The shapes that it makes and the way it drapes and the way it's sculpted into clothing is its function. When I look at real clothing in person, I want to know about both of those things. I want to illustrate both, and I want people to be able to look closely and imagine they can interpret a maker's method into the fabric. And I think in general, too, in fashion, most consumptive concepts of clothing design really center the sculpting over the fabric formation, which I think is a shame. So I do college, I work a lot on these sort of clipping mask style digital illustrations. I come home in 2015. Mom immediately could use my help in the shop, and I'm doing that full-time for about like a whole year and a half, I think, before she has to, quite suddenly, retire for health reasons. And she basically says, genuinely, it's quick notice, but no judgment. Either it's all yours for the next few years of treatment and recovery, or we shut it down now. And I didn't really have to think about that too hard, honestly. I said yes. I kind of knew what I was getting into. I had grown up in the shop space. I was aware it's a job in the arts and you're self-employed. You work really long hours to not get paid very much, and that's also the best case scenario because it means there's work to do. But the benefits are immense. It's a creative job, it's a challenging job. Customers bring me things that are interesting, that are beautiful concepts, that are engineering challenges. They bring me things that are impossible to do sometimes. That's also fascinating. And the immense privilege of having the equipment available to me to work on my own projects in any spare time I have is absolutely invaluable. So I said I would do it. So the bulk of the work is custom printing. A lot of business cards and wedding invitations. I love all that, but that is a discussion for another day. Another big part of the work is taking stock of what is actually here. Damon Press has been collecting equipment for 40 years now, a lot of it from shops that shut down or downsized or just like ejected their whole letterpress department through the 80s and 90s when digital was making letterpress seem completely obsolete, even more precipitously than offset had. So sometimes people would have equipment and it was like, bring it to someone who will use it or figure out where to put it or dump it in scrap metal. And so there's all these like buckets of type and galleys and galleys. And Mom knows a lot of what's in it or knew what was in it and where it was before I moved everything. And I learned what was in it as I moved everything. I have moved every single typecase and galley in this shop. I have picked it up and moved it somewhere else by now. I move furniture instead of going to therapy. I'm doing my best to catalog it when I have time. Thank you to Amy Redmond. I took a workshop from her about cataloging a type library that is heavily informing my spreadsheet usage. But this means, whenever I have a spare minute, when I start taking over the shop, I'm distributing decades of dusty old galleys, and I'm matching up orphans from different shops, and I'm marrying together decorative sets that have never lived together in one quarter case, and all this stuff in my hands going into my memory banks, and it just has to get used somewhere. So, parallel tracks that will eventually meet. There's the letterpress printing I grew up with, and the digital work that I did in school, and then there's this third thing, which is weaving. My mother is a printer, but she's also been a weaver, and her mother is a weaver too. My grandmother was weaving for about 42 years before it got too hard on her hands. These are both her work. The second one, this creamy white one, is essentially shifu paper, Japanese paper sliced thin and then rewoven into this coat that she made for my grandfather. And to me, they are basically the same thing, handset type and weaving. There's this essentially two-dimensional object that you have in mind that you have to engineer in extremely three-dimensional space. There's a certain number of tools, there's various human-engineered systems that cooperate with physics to get flexible but reliable results. You produce this 2D material that is then frequently manipulated back into 3 dimensions, and you always have all this information about the process packed into the surface of the object. You just have to know what to look for, and the object is informing you how it was made in space. So these 3 things do eventually converge into basically one idea of how to physically achieve these clipping masks with the letterpress tools that I have to make a print that communicates something like the tactile fascination I have with fabric. And I started with these really basic shapes because I was trying to determine what I could get away with on a motorized feed. Because you make this mask, and it's not just the mylar on top protecting the sheet from printing outside the lines. You also have to pull packing away from the area that you're not printing. For one thing, that protects the handset type you're using from getting smashed. So you make these simple shapes. The very first one I made was a triangle, just a straight up triangle. And then the second one I made was this little topiary bush. And I just wanted to test printing with a mask that was taped between the 2 grippers. So the mylar is just suspended between the 2 grippers, and you've got the packing pasted directly to the platen, to the tin pin over the platen. And because of the way that is in intense motion as the motorized CMP is opening and closing, I've made a really generous gutter in between the shape of the mylar negative space and the packing positive space. And so what I was testing there was, would it still print cleanly for a couple hundred impressions? And sure, I did, and I have those cards, and they're pretty cute. But it wasn't really continuously compelling. It was just sort of a science experiment to me. So I moved on to something else. I've done a few where the line art was digitally printed, and actually the digital printing goes down first with some like flood colors and all sorts of other stuff, and then the letterpress is printed on top afterwards. This is fine, but mostly it's just annoying. Digital registration is garbage compared to a clapper press, and also like figuring out papers that are compatible for digital and printing letterpress is like, okay, you can do it, but do you want to? I did a few where the line art was a linoleum block. This is more fun. I might go back to this at some point. I don't know. It's not quite right for me. First of all, it's not actually much more efficient than hand drawing the line art. You still can't do a huge number of the prints because the mask will start breaking down a lot faster than your linoleum block. Especially the parts of the mylar mask that are like any like small reaching elements that have to cover tiny areas sort of inside the general silhouette. Those ones, they're taking a lot of pressure and they're being sort of pinched in between the form and the sheet and the packing. So they just get a little fussy and they start bending and curling in ways that are not reliable. So the mask doesn't last that long anyway. More importantly, to me, the texture on a linoleum block, the way that I tend to illustrate linoleum, it's just not right. I do like pretty chunky line quality or just like big solid illustration sort of elements when I'm doing linoleum. And for these prints, I really prefer the fine lines that I get with just hand-done inks. It's better balanced with a lot of the tiny details of the decorative border stuff that I'm working with. And the line art also is really important for describing the three-dimensional version of the clothing. Like, it demonstrates the structure of the clothing with seam lines and the motion in the illustration with wrinkles, but I never want that information to overwhelm the pattern. Like, I always want to be able to see both the flat and the sculpted version at the same time. So I finally get actually satisfied with the process summer of 2021 when I start doing it just like this, with a digital mock-up to a printed pattern to hand-drawn inks. So this is the preferred method. And now let's get into some technical details. Each of these prints starts here in the digital sketch. I say sketch, this drawing has to be really nailed down pretty much in its entirety right here. It is my reference going forward to position the form against the sheet, to position the Mylar mask over the sheet. It goes on the light table at the end for the drawing stage. So I can make some small adjustments if I need to. Part of the reason that this works is that I'm drawing clothing fabric. They are a slightly forgiving geometry. But most elements of composition get decided here. I'm just making choices about the density of line art versus the pattern. I'm deciding whether or not I'm printing oversized or on final trim. I'm kind of making some determinations about where I'm going to have pin space and which corner is going to be register corner. I'm also thinking about the angle of the pattern printing compared to the composition of the piece. A lot of that planning is like happening in the back of my head while I'm doing this drawing stage. On the side there are a bunch of the digital references I collect, which is a lot of fashion photography, predictably, but anything that grabs me about textures, fabric samples, compositions, pleasing, geometry. I've got a couple tags on my resources blog to filter for what aspect I want to be looking at. So this piece is the latest one that I've done, and a big part of the reference pool is the costume design for Purple Rain. I was watching a recording from the concert tour, and there's all those impeccably tailored coats with the matching pants, and those big blocks of shiny fabric on stage with metallic applications, and there's a lot of silver and pink and purple, and I love the stiff, wide shoulders, and the way that structure moves or doesn't move with them while they're playing and dancing and jumping on top of things. And then the jacket, like V's down to the tiny waist on the trousers and those extremely tailored pants. And sure, prints is one thing. I personally got totally sidetracked by Wendy Malvaughn, I think that's how you say her name, playing guitar next to him. She had the same amazing kinds of suits. She had matching outfits for the show. She's very pretty, and the outfits are so cool, and her hair is amazing. So this isn't really her face or anything, but I sure was thinking about her. Once I've got a sketch, I print a couple copies for make-ready sheets. The most important thing for all of the next steps is preserving register corner so that I don't cause compounding problems of registration errors the more passes I use. It is true that registration on the sheet actually isn't determined by the relationship between the form and the sheet of paper, because it will print where the mask is exposing it to pressure. So the mask is what determines my registration from the sheet to the composition. But if I want a series of colors to line up in a reliable way, I still also have to have great registration from form to form in the pins. This is also the main reason that I only use clamshell action presses on these prints. The registration is just so much tighter. Fishtailing and the curvature of the cylinder are just going to bite you in this process. So I pick register corner in order to set the first form of type. A lot of the materials I'm using aren't meant to actually cover a large area, so I don't have any pieces to waste way outside the printing area. Or I have to do one color in multiple passes. That also happens a lot. But If I can avoid that, I plan ahead to just barely overflow the edges of the shape. And this means that before I set anything, I have to determine the angle of the sheet relative to the bed of the press, and outline just the shape I need inside a minimal form. So I'm checking the outer bounds of that form as well. That's the rectangle that I'm drawing there, to make sure I have room for 3 stable pins, even when the corners of the form extend way beyond the sheet edges, right? So now I've got this general reference to start setting type. I block out large amounts of negative space where I know I don't need decorative, and I'm just designing the density of the pattern inside the guides by hand. I know this step you could also do digitally. It's usually really basic math with the border materials, right? Like there's only so many pieces, and they're usually like 12s, 18s, 36s. You could block it all out on a grid ahead of time. I don't. I like to design for type with my hands. When I set the type, I'm usually looking for a certain degree of like organic randomness, but I also want to make sure that I'm covering the silhouette of the clothing in certain ways. Like, in order to imply that the pattern wraps around the 3D shape, you can't leave awkward blank corners without pattern. So I need to be sure I'm hitting small areas. Any outlier islands of the silhouette have to get covered so they still look intentional. And when I do multiple masks in order to jog the pattern in a couple different directions, I have to make sure that the different angles come head to head where the masks meet, and that they oppose each other actively to make a seam line or a fold interaction kind of pop out, right? I'm also usually planning multiple colors without being able to set more than one form at a time, so I'm leaving blanks to fill in later. After I have a form, I make my first mask to prepare actually printing. I have some mock-ups, I've got a register corner. I cut the mask from Mylar. Frequently, I do multiple masks, but this one, I'm thinking about these big flashy stage costumes of matching jacket and trousers. They're like bold blocks of color and shine on the stage, so for once I actually do want the whole suit to blend into one block. So I just set up one mask for this whole print, and crossing the lines between sleeves and torso and pants and everything are never going to break. Once I have the Mylar opening cut, then I trace the male die onto some 20-point Timpin paper through the mask and cut that out. I take a piece of 6-point Timpin paper as my base for the whole thing and account for pin space again and tape the Mylar down at a hinge opposite register corner. I've just got to be able to fit the print in underneath and lay the Mylar down flat without knocking into the pins. The last thing is I PVA the male die to the base inside the Mylar. I've called this whole mask setup a sandwich. It's not like a hot dog with the hinge. So I have my mask hot dog. I used to paste the die directly to the Platinum's Timpin back when I was more worried about the mask staying in register. But that hasn't been a big issue, and also that made it pretty much impossible to re-register the mask in a new position without starting over. So now I use this separate all-in-one arrangement. So the first color I'm printing on this print is the Silver Pass. I place the whole Silver Pass down on the sheet of Mylar, and then I position my pins first. So I get a pin position from my digital mock-up with the Mylar on top. The mask is what determines that my printing happens in the correct part of the sheet, but my pin position determines that I'm printing the right parts of the pattern in the right parts of the silhouette. So I'm closing up those corners and making sure all of the edges get implied, and I cover interesting conversion points in the future line art and set those pins in. Then I position my mask hot dog around the mock-up in the pins and tape it down to the platen side. That mask should stay right where it is, if at all possible. Each sheet goes into the pins inside the sandwich. The Mylar gets taped down to make sure it's flat and secure. Eventually there's going to be ink building up on the outside of the mask, so if it's not stabilized after a bunch of impressions, it does start depositing extra ink at the edges. You can clean them off. It's a big pain, especially because, again, the actual Mylar shape is frequently cut into such a weird shape that it's pretty delicate, actually. So if you try to, like, get solvent in there and like a rag to clean ink off of the Mylar mask, like mostly what you end up doing is just like bending delicate parts and messing things up. It's usually not worth it. So that's a whole color. Just do that 29 times. And then you just sort of like, you reset and you do the next colors. Again, the mask is supposed to be the relatively stable part of this process. The second color on this one is pink. I'm using the same border material, just in a different arrangement that I've already nearly run out of pieces. So I'm also setting up this pink form to be sets of circles, like these sets of squares are inscribing each other. So I set up my forms side by side and steal from my silver form as I set up my new pink one, referring to the silver form to do the math and place each of the pink pieces in sort of a drop and replace type matching form. It then goes into the exact same chase, same lockup, same register corner, and the pins and the mask both stay exactly in place for the second pass. Full disclosure, of course, position was not perfect, even though I saved register corner and everything. It's never totally perfect. It's just because, it's just different amounts of pressure that you put on the coins. And especially with this one, which is built out of squares, and so you don't actually have, no one direction is better to apply pressure first, because corners are just knocking into each other no matter what you do. So these lockups were an immense pain. And there's still just tiny little bits of adjustment that have to get made to make sure that the two colors really line up with each other. But those are the tough ones. Pass 3, easy peasy. Just a couple sets of rule. It's these bright cyan lines, right? Because when I was watching this Prince concert, and there's these shiny loud fabrics, and they're leaping all over the stage dancing, but dancing also makes me think a whole lot about gravity, like that thing that your body's momentum is fighting, pulling at you perpendicular to the stage. So the third pass to me is about sort of a little bit of weight added into the composition. Pass 4, I struggled with a bit, because there's just something missing. I tried another thing with rule that didn't work at all, hated that. I tried to think some more about concert stagecraft. Tons and tons of dry ice, just all over the stage, reflecting light all over the place, but sort of vaguely, so that there's this floaty illusion where you hide the stage in the fog and pretend that the black space behind them is infinite. And related to that, I had just gone on a road trip with some friends in September. We went to Ashland. We did see some plays, but also we stopped at a children's science museum, which I recommend for adults to do. They're very cool and fun. Anyway, there's this hallway full of optical illusions, which I took a couple pictures of to think about. I knew I would want them later. And these optical illusions include some kinds of patterns with these interactions between repeating angles and disruptive curves that make it confusing what is straight or perpendicular or where the horizon is. So I just sort of wander around the shop for a while trying to figure out what texture is going to achieve some of those things for me. There's that organic motion of light bending around and reflecting off dry ice. There's all the reflective sequins in people's clothes. There's strange tangents on repeated patterns. So I make this fourth form out of just a bunch of 12-point square boxes, like for printing check boxes. And I get a bunch of interactions I finally. Some interesting clusters of lines where the pale cyan boxes break apart the regular squares, and a lot of places where they describe the edges of the silhouette that I was missing. So that's the printing stage, done. There's all the printed sheets in the edition. There's 29 in this edition, plus a couple spares to test inking on. The mask is in the press here with all its built-up ink from 4 colors. And that's the last form that I set for the pale cyan pass. For the inking stage, I have a smaller light table that I picked up at second use. It's 2.5 feet square-ish, and I took the legs all off. I love it because I can largely dismantle it and recover space in the middle of an edition if I have to take a break to work on real paid work. It sits on the bindery table at a nice working height, and I take the digital mock-up down, And then each print usually takes about 20 minutes to get the basic lines in. Another 10 or 15 for details, or like big color washes, depending on what I've designed. I've got a comfortable style that is working for me so far. They're not overly complicated in the line art, partly because I'm doing 10 to 30 copies, and what do I have the patience to do 30 times? So I can invest some amount of finicky detail in the line work, like weird little jewelry designs, or on this one, you've got to have the hair represented, but for the most part, the illustration has to be relatively stripped down. I need a couple of lines to describe the three-dimensionality of the clothing in the face of how two-dimensional the pattern is, but I also don't want to overcomplicate what's been printed. So I'm just selecting for a couple graphic elements that pull out the real object from the flat silhouette. And a lot of other distracting details get edited out. And there it is. The final print has this inked line work over and around the relief printing. And actually the whole masked area has this sort of softly pillowed embossing effect on it. It shows the pinch in the sheet between the male tympan backing and the mylar mask, which when I was first doing these I thought was an error that I was going to have to figure out how to correct. But I have learned that they're additive. Some of these designs are more personal than others. I do just love clothing and design. And I also like to think about why people dress the way they do. I like all kinds of communication that happen without language. I started designing this one on basis of the pattern, because I was thinking about, kinds of like large weave fabrics that are very surface communicative about how they were made. Things like houndstooth, things like plaid, things where like the iconic texture of them is distinctly because of the weaving process. But the structure of the coat itself is a completely different kind of icon. It's a denim coat, which is why I went to the trouble of piecing this one together from 3 separate masks and jogging the angle in a bunch of different places. Because to me, there's something pretty distinctive about the shape a denim jacket makes on a person. The interaction, especially around the yoke area over the shoulders, how the shoulders fall off of the body, and the way that that really stiff fabric drapes across your back, especially because the colors and the textures that I was going to print aren't really like denim. I really wanted the structure of the coat to sort of fold out of the print, that central sort of triangle meeting point at the yoke. A denim coat is the most comforting piece of clothing on the planet to me. This is my dad's old fleece-lined one that he got from Chubby and Tubby's in the 80s. When I was a kid on drives back home late at night when it was cold, my sister and I would use this coat as a blanket in the back seat of the truck. And this one is my mother's. Hers is flannel lined. It's way too big for either of us, but I steal it all the time anyway. The pockets are huge. It's really nice. And this one is mine. I finally have my own. My uncle gave it to me a few years ago. He got it from salvage, and it had some hand-painted decorations on it, which I decided to cover. So I went through the boxes of fabric scraps we've got, and there's all this leftover upholstery fabric. And it's this busy but muted sort of jungle scene with ferns and tigers and green and pale pinks and yellows. And there was this big egg-shaped couch in the living room when I was like a baby and a toddler, and it used this fabric. So I whip-stitched the patches over the paint, and it always makes me feel a little bit gender question mark when I wear it, which is a nice bonus, and it's my favorite coat. These aren't all the same idea, exactly, but I do think they're those compatible parallel tracks. of nostalgia in this yellow and pink color palette, and then there's this comfort in the structure of a denim jacket, and there's this thick texture conveying the process I've done. And I look at it, and it all folds together into a piece about how important this inheritance of process and materials is. Mm-hmm. Okay. I kind of like. Do you want a prop? You can have a prop.
Do I have a prop?
You can just hold it in your hand. I don't care.
Okay. Okay.
So, okay. All that we're doing is talking about why is it named Day Moon Press? Because I have said it wrong.
I have heard you say it incompletely,
right?
Or in a funny. So it's been a long time since I've actually. When I was a child and taking piano from a local piano teacher, I was given a piece called Day Moon by, I believe, George Frederick Mackay, local composer, modern. And it was a very lovely, sort of spooky little piece that I could play. That was crucial. I loved it. And the phrase stuck in my head all my life. When you see the day moon, it surprises you a little bit. And you see it, I think, more as a rock, as a physical object in the sky. You see it as something with texture and solidity to it. It's not just a reflector. And to me, the difference between offset printing, which is plain a graphic, and letterpress printing is that feeling of texture. I don't mean like punching hard. I mean like just a subtle feeling that this came from a physical process. It's not just a light reflector. Offset printing reflects light. Letterpress printing gives you a little depth and a little a reminder of how it was made. And that's what I really loved about the phrase, working with the process. And so I stuck with it. And the longer I printed letterpress, the more that was reinforced by seeing other people react to letterpress printing. They look at it and they don't know quite what's different about it, and then they realize what's different about it, and they're enchanted. And that's the day moon.